Well, thank you everybody for coming, and especially thank you, Francois, for having me as part of this group, and I'm deeply indebted to the Aspect Working Group for giving me feedback on early pieces of this book. So I'm really happy to be here today. I will give you a little bit of background on how this book came about. I am, as some of you know, a former practitioner. I've been a peacekeeper for a number of years of my life. And a number of the questions that I elaborate theoretically in this book came up as part of my job in that capacity. I grew increasingly frustrated of how in international organizations, but not only in international organizations, how international actors, statesmen, politicians, etc., justified international intervention. We use abstract principles to justify what we do and to kind of garner political consensus. And in fact, being a practitioner also deployed in several peacekeeping operations, I realized that these justifications are really not enough. They're actually misleading. That this attempt to justify what we do without looking at the particular in terms of universals has led to disasters. Prominent examples are how little attention we pay to conditions on the ground in Haiti, and how little attention are we paying now in condemning particular governments as being ugly and moral monsters without really assessing conditions on the ground, how we could intervene to change this situation, and who are the other players involved. So I really got very frustrated with appeasing solutions and discourses that also kind of put us at ease with regard to our failure. We called our failure unintended consequences, and most of the times we blamed the people we were supposed to help for being the cause for these failures. So I started asking myself questions. Why is that? What is the kind of ontological imaginary that makes us imagine that we can make reality abide by our planning rationalities and our abstract principles? And if we think about that, the whole discipline of international relations is kind of relying upon what I call a substantialist ontology. A substantialist ontology that is very much rooted upon the Kantian traditions and how Kant imagined we can justify ethics, right? We justify ethics upon the division between the natural world, which is in a way an obstacle to reaching the perfect peace that is not within the reach of the individual human being, but is maybe aspirationally possible for humanity and is in a way warranted by divine providence. But there is always this abstraction, there is always this opposition between nature and rationality, between the drive of ethics and the natural inclination, between emotion and what we can reason about. Why is that so? Why do we and why do we need to imagine the world this way? Newtonian physics also imagined the world, the natural world, in very mechanical terms. So it kind of supports this imaginary where there is a mechanical nature out there, and then there is this world of reason that is outside nature. We as humans, as subjects, belong to a different place, to a different ontological sphere. Well, this is probably not the only way we can imagine how we fit in the world. And as a matter of fact, a number of years ago, out of serendipity, and basically out of the suggestion of a colleague who talked to me about the book, I met a book called Meeting the Universe Halfway, written by feminist physicist Karen Barat. And Karen Barat imagines the universe along the lines of world physics in very different terms. She argues that the first ontological being are not entities but phenomena, that nothing worthwhile talking about can be explained in isolation. And that there is the natural state of the world. It's not a state of ontological closure and separation, but is a state of interconnectedness. And that is a book that is called Meeting the Universe Halfway, and once I started reading it, I couldn't put it down. Because in my view, it raises fundamental questions about, is it possible to imagine causality and the way we inhabit the world along different lines? Would it be possible if we embrace an ontological imaginary inspired by quantum physics to imagine an ethics without foundations that doesn't need to rely upon a notion of subjectivity that pre-exists relations, modeled along the lines of masculinity, power, and sovereignty? That book triggered me thinking about how important are ontological imaginaries to provide a appeasing narrative of what we do. How important are for conceptualizing ethics and political agency, and in fact for the possibility of reimagining agency in general. So the book is about these things. Is it possible to imagine our existence differently without starting from substances? And I start by mapping the prevalent ontological imaginaries of international relations, and I argue that international relations is by and large substantialist, even in those streams of the discipline that claim that they are not. So the beginning of the book is a critique of structuralism, both in its international relations version and in its Marxist versions in a way, because to me, Walt's structuralism is a perspective that is constructed around the idea that there is an overarching organizing principle or the absence of thereof, anarchy, and some units and that are already formed, and that this overarching principle can explain everything. Well, maybe not so fast. Why do we need to imagine the world as so much driven by one principle? And why do we have to imagine that entities are already there? I will not elaborate here on my critique of governmentality and certain version of Marxism, which I develop in my chapter, and my critique of also some version of constructivism. That I have different reasons for criticizing these positions. In particular, even constructivism is, in my view, in certain regards, substantialist when they use ideas as causes that function along linear relations of causality. And I bring about some specific example of which scholars embrace this vision of causality of ideas that are imagined as billiard balls, that tame relations of causality that in any way function along the line of Newtonian causality. Well, what I argue here is that Karen Barad does something very different. She focuses instead on the apparatus. And for her, and she is also, in a way, in addition to embracing quantum physics, she also embraces a lot of Foucault theoretical apparatus. She argues that nothing is out there in nature, no ontological closure exists without the application of an apparatus. And this is not, the fact that we can see different behaviors of particles with different apparatus is not an epistemological problem, but for her is an ontological problem. It's not possible, while we intervene with the world, we create ontological, what she calls ontological cuts. So we are agents. Our knowledge is a form of agency. We can never get out of the apparatus. The apparatus can never be observed from an external standpoint. But the apparatus is what creates ontological cuts. We are part of apparatuses are thick. But reality is, at the same time, thick and flexible. There is nothing out there that is already predetermined. We are intra-agentially connected with the world. And this, for me, trigger a completely different way of looking at who we are as subjects and what kind of agency we can exert and how we can justify our political agency. Abstractions are not sufficient because practices have ontological effects. What is happens in practices, and the future is not already encompassed in the present. By interacting with the world, we may create different ontological effects. At the same time, there is no subjectivity that is out there already predefined in its ontological contours without thinking of ourselves as being part of phenomena of which we are part. Karen Barad uses in fact a Foucauldian conceptual apparatus when she talks about how dispositif works. Dispositif for Foucault, if you think about it, are not only instruments of observations, but they are productive of specific realities and specific subjectivities. And Karen Barad makes this argument, and through this argument she bridges between philosophy and ontology and ethics. In fact, to me, starting from a non-substantialist standpoint, pushes us to ask completely different questions when we talk about justification of agency. The questions would not be what kind of normative principle can be thought as universal, valid across circumstances, but is what kind of political consequences would our action trigger, and with what kind of means do we intend to act. If practices are ontologically important, if the tools through which and the apparatuses through which we intervene in reality have ontological powers and cause ontological effects, the means through which we think we're going to achieve certain ends are not a corollary, are not at the periphery of ethical decision. They are very central to ethical decision. Principles are not good enough. Principles are appeasing to us because we can always find for ourselves the excuse of having acted for good intentions without looking at all at what were the circumstances on the ground, at what were the tools we had in our hands to intervene in that situation. I'm glad that Ashley also talked about tools, even in a very different way. To me, it's a very important concept, in fact. So this ethos, an intragential ethos, based upon a quantum ontology that reimagines who we are as subjects and the way we fit in the world, also invites us to reimagine how we can act in it to change it. We have to ask ourselves different questions that are not universal but very particular. And most of all, we have to assume responsibility all the way through. I argue that a quantum ontological imaginary at the same time raises the bar for making ethical decisions because abstract principles are not good enough. I actually argue in my book that they can be a very good excuse for producing aberrant results. So they raise the bar for making ethical decisions. They invite to prudence and a very careful consideration of means to ends, as if we were to have to live with the consequences, right? This is a big problem in international intervention. As Jean-Marie Guénaud, former Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations, has observed many times, most of the time we intervene, but we don't have to live with the consequences. But, well, this is an invitation to look at how the world would look like after we intervene. So it raises the bar for adjudication of ethics. The other consequence of adopting an intra-agential ontological imaginary is that it also broadens what we can consider a valid and plausible ethical and political initiative. I argue that in this perspective, because causality is not linear and because we are interactively connected with the world, we can imagine agency in a way that is a little bit broader than structuralists did. In fact, I have a predicament with structuralism because it stifles the imagination for political agency. There are only certain, especially in some very rigid ways of rigid version of Marxism, only certain type of action that would reverse international or the national political order. Only the revolutionary action that would reverse the organizing principle of the whole are valid and plausible and effective political actions. Well, if one doesn't embrace a structuralist version, maybe there are several ways how we can create cascade effects. And these ways can be rooted in very micropolitical initiatives. So micropolitics and starting acting where there is a political opportunity could be plausible. However, this agency is always to be exerted in line with Foucault and with Karen Barat, I say, with prudence. Just the Nike motto, no matter how you do it, just do it, is definitely a recipe for disaster when making ethical choices. I think I will close here. And I open it up for questions, and I'm sure I skipped over a number of concepts, but yeah, we can talk more on the Q&A.
Sounds good.
Okay?
Thanks a lot, Laura.
Thank you.